Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. We are reading in the virtual reading group currently Hannah Arendt's book on revolution. One of my probably my favorite of her books. So I look forward to discussing it with you. We're in the chapter, The Social Question. This is clearly one of the more controversial chapters in all of Hannah Arendt's writing, probably right up after her essay on Little Rock. And it's controversial for a number of reasons. One is simply her comments on poverty and the place of the social question in politics. And two, some of her comments on the American Revolution and its absence of the social question. Let me quickly as I can sketch out what I take to be the argument of the chapter, and then we can get into a conversation. I hope you had a chance to listen to the lecture in which I tried to go through these issues pretty carefully. The beginning of the chapter is an observation, which is the claim that she makes that poverty is not the same as misery, or that mass poverty is misery and is different from poverty. What this means is she's trying to make a distinction, one that she finds reflected in the writings of travelers and observers in America and France in the colonial and post-colonial period, early American period, in which people said there's no poverty in America. And they said that even though people were poor, they weren't impoverished. And she tries to make sense of this with this distinction between poverty and misery, one that we don't hear very much about today. We talk about the poor and the rich. And what she's basically saying is that poor people can still be dignified, can still have a role in the world, have a role in politics, feel good about themselves, and feel visible and part of a democratic society. The miserable, le malheureux, the French word, the truly miserable, can't. They are so destitute that they need to spend their time searching for bread and searching for shelter and simply attending to the needs of their bodies, and as a result, they disappear from sight. And that this is very much her view of, and this goes to her view of what the true evil of poverty or misery is. It's not having less money for her, because the poor can often be very happy and very satisfied with life, just as the rich can be miserable. It's not money that causes people to be happy or unhappy. It's respect. It's recognition. It's a feeling of meaningfulness. And to go back to these lines from The Origins of Totalitarianism, which we keep coming back to because they're so central for Arendt, what it means to be human and the true human right, the right to have rights for her, is not to be fed or to be rich or to even to be alive. It's to matter. It's to act and speak in a public realm in ways that people listen to you, and thus your life has significance. And so she takes this very seriously, and she says that you can be impoverished and not miserable, and that she says that amidst misery, though, the legitimacy of the government is always in question, especially in a democratic age. And so in the French Revolution, where there was widespread misery, the French revolutionaries, who were largely wealthy, could only seek to make themselves legitimate by parading their compassion and this for the poor. And this compassion, which is sort of thought of as a natural virtue by Rousseau, is perverted by Robespierre and the revolutionaries into what she calls pity. Pity for the lump mass of the miserable. And this pity is actually cruel, because if you pity this lump mass, you see them as a group in need of your help and assistance, and you, in a sense, dehumanize them. You treat them as pitiable, and you see it as your job to determine what is best for them. And this leads to the kind of do-goodism, but false do-goodism that further makes these miserable people invisible by your thinking that you know what's right for them and what's better for them. And she says that pity can be more cruel than cruelty itself. And this is, in many ways, the history of how the social question, for Arendt, perverts revolutions. Revolutions are about freedom. They're about bringing all people, the poor and the rich, into the public world so that they matter. And when the social question comes to dominate, when the question of the revolution becomes, how do we take the miserable and make them less hungry and better housed and more wealthy, we actually lose the concern for their freedom, and instead take away their freedom and promise them bread. And so the old panet, the bread and circus, which she talks about within the context of the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky. The idea here that the people actually don't care about freedom. That's the Grand Inquisitor's claim to Jesus, who's come down. All they care about is bread and circus, eating and being entertained. And Arendt says that the social revolutions, which come out of the French revolutions, which are bred out of a pity for the miserable, de-emphasize freedom and emphasize instead bread and circus. And the key quote of the entire chapter, I think, if you want to understand what's going on, is on page 102, where she summarized back at the end of the chapter. And she writes on 102, although the whole record of past revolutions demonstrates beyond doubt that every attempt to solve the social question with political means leads into terror, and that it is terror which sends revolutions to their doom, it can hardly be denied that to avoid this fatal mistake is almost impossible when a revolution breaks out under conditions of mass poverty. And so in this summarizing sentence, she says a couple things. First, that the attempt to solve the social question by political means leads to terror. The more we seek to solve misery through politics, we will have to disempower the people and seek to solve the problem for them through a technocratic solution, which means that we will, in a sense, terrorize the people and take away their freedom. Because we will have to start taking away property here and giving it there, and that's going to lead to terror, because who's going to give up their property? And we're going to have to, tell people, you've all got to move out of this area because it's going to get flooded a lot, and move you here. And if people say, I don't want to move, that leads to terror. And so once you start trying to, from the top down, solve the social question politically, you run into terror and totalitarianism. And this is what she sees happening over and again in France, in Russia, in Haiti, and in all the quote-unquote social-driven revolutions. And that this, she says, is not unexpected, because in a conditions of mass poverty, how can you expect there not to be demands to solve the social question? And this is the tragedy of modern revolutions, that this great tradition of revolutions, which originates with the idea of founding freedom, over and again gets perverted by pity and the social question and turns terroristic. So if one controversial claim is in this main story, which is that the politicization of the social question threatens terror and thus has often been seen to be Arendt's disinterest in the social question, which I don't think is correct. I mean, she is. She certainly at times speaks in favor of social welfare programs of sorts. She just thinks of those as important technocratic solutions as opposed to political solutions. But it is seen as part of her heartlessness, this main story. The secondary story, right, which is that there's one exception to this, the American Revolution, is another controversial part of the chapter, because in that story, what she says is the Americans are the only revolution that was lucky enough that didn't try to solve the social question. And they didn't because they didn't see that the social question existed. And that was a good thing because it allowed the revolution to found freedom rather than address the social question. The problem here, of course, is that as she herself points out, the invisibility of the social question was incredibly both racist and sexist. There were more miserable people in America per capita than in France, namely the slaves. And there were women everywhere in both places who were not publicly recognized. And yet neither the slaves nor the women mattered. And she says they just weren't seen. Their misery wasn't noticed by observers or by the people who were writing the Constitution. And on the one hand, she clearly thinks this is a bad thing. She talks about it as the great crime, slavery, and how this was a clear oversight. On the other hand, she says it was sort of lucky because in doing so, they enabled the revolution to focus on freedom and not the social question, and thus avoided terror and set in motion the only free revolution of the modern period. And of course, this has been controversial, for important and good reasons. Not to say that it's right or wrong, but I think the controversy is there and needs to be dealt with, and we need to be as honest about it as we can. Okay, I'm gonna stop there and begin our conversation. And I see there's already a bunch of questions, so let me see what I can do. And again, just for those of you who may be new, the rules are here. You can ask a question either by writing it in the chat or by butting in at some point. And if you have a very relevant point to something we're saying, please feel free to jump in. Pat Moriarty writes, is her analysis of the French Revolution valid? Generally accepted by historians. Valid. Arendt is not a historian. She's a political thinker. I don't think that French historians would say that she gets everything right. I don't think she would insist on that. I don't think she says anything wrong. I mean, she's using sources. She's certainly, citing facts. It's a short presentation of the French Revolution. You're never going to be in any kind of short presentation, especially one that's trying to make a point. You're never going to give a balanced view of the French Revolution. So I guess what I'd have to ask Pat is which facts are you interested in? Is it true that most of the people in the revolutionary parliament were of the wealthier classes? I believe that's true. I'm sure there may be a couple of exceptions, but I believe that's true.
My question was based on her claim, essentially, that compassion is what defeated passion into pity, is what defeated or made the French Revolution translate into terror. Was it compassion? Was that a core issue for the terrorism eventually?
Okay,
is that what accepted? Not a fact, but there was terror. There was but the word compassion is something I'm curious whether historians use that as a.
I think so. There's a couple things to say. One is um, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was very much the intellectual father of the French Revolution, um, writes a lot about compassion as a natural virtue that is corrupted by society. And so, in some sense, Arendt is taking that from Rousseau. And then the question would be, to what extent is she right to translate that into the French Revolution? And I think she is right to do so. I don't know the French historiography well enough to say whether people have contested this general idea that she makes, um, that it was driven by compassion and pity. But there's no doubt that the French Revolution, led by Robespierre and others, brought the masses, the people, the malheureux, the suffering masses, to the front of their consideration. Whether they talked about compassion or not, I'm not entirely sure. My colleague Kevin Duong, if he were on, would, I'm sure, have a lot to say about it. But I've read many critiques of the book, and that's not a place where people I've at least encountered have been critical of it. So that's all I can say. If there's anyone on who has knowledge of this in a way that would add to it, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Hi, Roger,
I'm
it's
not,
Sam. I'm just happy to add, or I can add really quick that, Robespierre, Saint Eustace, are all using the language of compassion, drawing from Rousseau. Rousseau saw compassion as the root of all morality, which was necessary to the way that he thought about constructing the social contract. And the revolutionaries were using that language at the time.
Thank you, Sam. I mean, I think that's helpful, and so I don't think that's a very controversial point. Um, but the historians can always complicate things, and they should. The historians look at often, the nitty gritty, and Arendt's looking at the big picture. There's no doubt about that. Suzanne, who had posted in Google, writes, "What might Arendt have made of liberation theology and efforts by its practitioners to identify with the poor and radically change society? Here's religion placed right in the middle of the political sphere." I imagine Arendt would be sympathetic to liberation theology. I don't know if she ever uttered anything about it in her writings. Arendt certainly believed that there was a level of poverty below which, if one fell, would be dehumanizing. That's her claim. And liberation theology is so beautifully named, and I think even not just named, but thought, because it places liberation, freedom, at the core. It's not just about feeding people, it's about freeing people. And that's Arendt's emphasis, is to free people. And the way you free people is you make it so that they don't have to struggle simply to stay alive. And as long as they don't have to struggle to stay alive, they are free. Now, there's different levels of freedom, and there's different ways you can be free. Who is more free? Someone who owns a small plot of land and is a farmer and works his or her farm and doesn't have many vacations, but basically lives their lives how they want to, or a high-placed consultant who goes where his company tells him to go and works the jobs his company tells him to work. The consultant clearly has more money, has a lot of opportunities, but in many ways is less free in how he or she organizes his life on a daily basis than maybe the farmer, or the painter or the small business person. And so Arendt always brings these questions again back to freedom. Again, it's very clear, and she is on record saying so, that she believes that there is a certain level of standard of living which any civilized society should provide for its people. So it's not that she's against welfare in general, but she doesn't think that welfare should focus on equalizing the economic realm. It should simply provide enough of a floor so that people can freely decide how to organize their lives. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of wiggle room in where she would come down on how much welfare and not. And she hasn't talked about it in the kind of detail that would allow anyone to know answers to those questions. But I'm sorry, this is a bit off the topic of liberation theology. Sympathy, we have a number of words: sympathy, compassion, pity. Arendt certainly believes in compassion as a kind of caring for another person, a one person. And to the extent liberation theology speaks to that, she would be in favor. She also believes in sympathy, I think. You should try and see the world from another person's point of view. This is one of the cores of her thought. But pity, she sees as a kind of setting oneself so far above and beyond people that they look small and tiny, and you want to help them. And it actually does more to help you feel powerful than to actually help them, in her reading. So, Suzanne, you might have to tell me a little bit more about liberation theology if you want more of an answer to that question. But I think in general, she's sympathetic from what I understand of it. Bob writes, what implication, if any, does Arendt's position on the social question bear on Obamacare repeal proposals? Would she regard governmental healthcare insurance as creeping social questionism, a legitimate function of lawmaking irrelevant to the concerns, or something else? Is it too pedestrian to ask? Yeah. Well, I mean, if this were my class at Bard, Bob, the first thing I would say is, well, what do you think? Hannah Arendt never wrote about Obamacare. And so I don't have, as a Hannah Arendt expert, to the extent I am one, don't have the Hannah Arendt answer at my fingertips. What I'd say is this: you have to go back to principles for her. Principles are guiding ideas. They're not sort of set in stone metaphysical principles. They're practical principles. And one principle is we should there's a basic level at which you should be guaranteed a life so that you can freely participate in public. Obviously, if you're sick, that deeply impacts your ability to appear in public, especially if your body is rebelling against you. And so there's an argument, I think, that some sort of medical care is consistent with Arendt's understanding of the political avoidance of misery as opposed to poverty. So I think that those, though, who argue that healthcare is a right, I think will not find a whole lot of help in Arendt. I mean, it can be a civil right, but she certainly wouldn't think it's a human right. I don't think. But I don't know, Bob. I'll ask you, what do you think? You asked the question.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to principles. So I was saying creeping socialism or social creepingism, and just trying to find out what the implications are for some of the questions that we're dealing with today. Of course, she could not have known about Obamacare, but there were other social legislation issues in the air at the time.
I mean, just to say, I'm not an expert on Obamacare either. So, but I mean, I know one of the controversial parts of Obamacare is that everybody has to buy insurance, right? And you get penalized or taxed, as Justice Roberts said, if you don't. It's not a penalty, it's a tax. That's the kind of creeping social questionism, as you put it. That's the kind of thing where we're going to actually say we're going to impose our on you certain obligations because we think it's good for society. And the argument is clearly rational, right? If the healthy people choose not to enter, it will cost more for everybody. But you know, I could see a Arendtian argument against that requirement. I am not saying she would be against it in practice. I have no idea. Um, I I think the idea that it's a federal program, right, and that everybody sort of is supposed to impose a single view of how much health care everyone's going to get across the 50 states would probably be something she would question. Um, uh, you know, those are, I think, two of the things about that I know about Obamacare that she would question, that I think she might question. Uh, on the other hand, I think the general principle that in a wealthy society, um, people should be provided with basic health care is, I think, one that I hate talking for Hannah Arendt, but I see no opposition to that in the principles of her work. The idea that healthcare is a right, I think, is a ridiculous idea. I mean, just personally, in the sense of, well, how much healthcare? I mean, it's one of those things that begs the question. Yeah, okay, healthcare is a right, but to how much, until when? How many? And does everybody have a right to, spend $100,000 a day on keeping oneself alive indefinitely? Well, we could. It's just one of those statements that I don't think it's a cliche, it's a slogan, and I don't think it speaks any kind of truth. And I think she would probably, I would imagine she would agree with that. But the general idea that freedom requires a certain base level of health is I think clear. And in a wealthy society, I think we should, in some ways, help those who are sicker and poorer out. Was one that she would clearly agree with. An observation and a question from Bob. I'm watching Rick. This is Bob again. I'm watching Rick Burns and Sarah Botstein, Leon Botstein's daughter, series on the war in Vietnam. I am left with some of the rage I felt then and still feel now, though not as strong. Does Arendt's Robespierre translate? Is this irrelevant to our deliberations? Hegel said nothing great was ever accomplished without passion. How about nothing ungreat? What are you enraged about, Bob? Just so I know. I haven't been watching it, I have to admit.
It just brings back memories. At the time, I was involved in the anti-war activities, and then I was brought into the draft board at some point. I was entitled to a student deferment, and I was just totally enraged at anything anybody said. Of course, I wasn't in the military, so they couldn't do much to me, but anything the lieutenant who was in charge of the group said, I challenged and tried to get all the other soldiers or inductees to go along. They were very silent. They didn't know what to think. And I got home, and I was married at the time, and I still am, to the same person. And I was just really, really wild.
Well, congratulations on your marriage and your protest. So I mean, those of us who've read her essays on this period know that she was also quite opposed to the Vietnam War, and she was quite supportive of the protests against it. She thought it was on the one hand, she saw the war as a kind of creeping imperialism that would subvert the American idea of freedom, which was local, right? So, one of the things that I try and always point out is that her opposition to centralization, which a lot of conservatives like because they say, oh, see, we don't like the welfare state being centralized. And liberals say, see, she was conservative because she was opposed to centralization. But she was also opposed to centralization in foreign affairs and increasing centralized military and imperialist policies. And she saw imperialism as great a danger to freedom as she did the welfare state. She saw them as two different sides of a similar danger, the increasing centralization of power and thus the disempowerment of people on the periphery and in local politics. So she saw the Vietnam protests as deeply important on the one hand, of a repoliticization of the country and of people. But, and this goes to your passion point, Bob, she also was critical of the protests to the extent they, in her mind, were more passionate than thoughtful. Because that, what happened was, she said, is that they didn't see the real issues at stake, which was freedom. And they presented it as other kinds of issues, as compassion with the Viet Cong or with the Vietnamese. And these kinds of approaches didn't succeed in making the kind of case in a more powerful way that she thinks they could have made if they had articulated it within an American vision. They picked sides, in a sense, of some Americans against other Americans. And they also took on a Marxist tint and therefore alienated a lot of Americans. And what she says is that if they had better understood the situation as one of fighting against a centralized imperialist rule in the name of American freedom, she thinks they might have been more successful and less divisive. And this brings up the discussion of solidarity, which comes up in this text, which I highlighted in the lecture if you had a chance to see it. She makes a distinction between two different approaches to create solidarity in a democracy. One is through pity, in which you seek to reach out to other people through a kind of passion and compassion and pity. But the problem with pity, she says, is that it doesn't ever reach all people. It doesn't reach the powerful. It doesn't reach the strong. It doesn't reach the rich. It doesn't reach those who feel satisfied in some way. And thus it divides. Whereas solidarity, she says, is a kind of intellectual as opposed to passionate attempt to see ourselves as part of a common project. And she suggests that solidarity is the more just and more revolutionarily free way to seek a commonality as opposed to pity. Peter writes, does, for example, land redistribution naturally or necessarily lead to terror as opposed to simply coercive violence? Are these the same? Okay, not naturally or necessarily. I mean, it's possible that land distribution is seen as just, and even the people whose land is being distributed acquiesce in it to some degree. And it may be seen as somewhat violent, but not unjust, and therefore there's no need for terror. What leads to terror, Peter, is actually what she calls the hypocrisy of those who need to present themselves as purely good. Right, that's part of what's going on here. What Robespierre and Saint-Just and Danton and others did is they wanted to show themselves to be the protectors of the malheureux, the poor, the miserable, and to present themselves as more so than others. And thus, anyone who ever backtracked and said, okay, I'm with the poor, I'm with the malheureux, but maybe we shouldn't take away everything that the bourgeoisie own. You say that, and then immediately someone says, "Take it all," and they claim that the person who's saying, "I'm with you, but maybe not all the way," is a hypocrite. And it's this hypocrisy that leads for what we call the hunt for hypocrites, which leads to terror. I mean, violence, taking away property, is not terror. Terror is something very different. It's interrogating innocent people to see if they are pure enough to be allowed to stay in politics. Terror, this is, I think, what a lot of people on the left are in a kind of civil war of the left right now. And there are people on the left saying, "I'm of the left, but I don't think we should be going so far with, let's say, for example, Antifa violence." And other people say, "You're a hypocrite. You're not really of the left." And so we're in a position right now where the charge of hypocrisy is vibrant and widespread around the country and within the left, and that's a kind of prelude to terror. And while I certainly don't think we're in a terrorist phenomena right now, there are a lot of people, I think, especially in certain leftist communities, like college campuses or some college campuses, who do feel somewhat terrorized right now. And that's I think, closer to what is at stake here, more so than land redistribution. Land redistribution you can make a case for it, you can pass laws about it, you can do it legally, and some people might be upset and they might feel violated, but that's not the same thing as terror. Peter, does that make sense? Is that all right? You can come back to that if you want, Peter. There's a comment from Hannah Arendt presents the American Revolution as politically successful because its players kept the political issues and avoided the social questions: poverty, human bondage, women. I wonder if it's still reflected in some respect to the politics of today, and why revolution. It seems to me is not possible, even though we do see moments when protest against certain issues is present in society. I'm thinking about the fact that this country has still not had a meaningful conversation about race, something Bill Clinton called for in his presidency. It's interesting. We had a speaker last year at the Arendt Center conference, DeRoy Murdoch, who's I think a very interesting political commentator on Fox News, who's a gay black conservative. And he got up and said, "I'm tired of people saying we haven't had a conversation on race. It seems like that's all we ever talk about." I generally disagree with him. I agree with Johanna. I just point that out because it's an interesting perspective. So we were talking about our conference for 2018 at the Arendt Center recently, and I really wanted to do a conference on race, directly on it, and race and Hannah Arendt and what she can bring to it. And everyone I kept talking to said, "You're asking for, you want to elevate a conversation, and it's just not going to happen. We're not going to ever have that conversation you want, and it's stupid to try." And so we chose we're going to do a smaller conference on it. But this is a very personal issue for me. I feel very strongly about it. I do think we need to have a conversation on race. I think it's a difficult one. I think there's a lot of terror involved in it, a lot of hypocrisy on all sides. And so, Johanna, your question, if I understand it, is, can we ever have that conversation? Can we ever, will we ever be able to found a free civilization in which race is not, which doesn't exclude people from freedom? Alexis de Tocqueville said that the one issue that may destroy the American Republic is racism. And Hannah Arendt said the one issue that may destroy the American Republic is racism. They both saw it. I think they're both right. And in many ways, it's much harder to overcome racism than it is to overcome slavery. You can make slavery illegal. It's much harder to overcome racism than to overcome Jim Crowism. You can make Jim Crowism illegal. But racism is something that lasts. It's part of an imaginary. And it's an imaginary that white people have as well as people of color have. And rich people have it and poor people have it, and in different ways. And it's very complicated. And there's ways in which, we make blackness positive, and there's ways in which we make it negative. That it will ever disappear in this country, or at least in my lifetime, I think is not going to happen. The question is, can you in some way revalue it, reimagine it in ways that even after we legally get rid of the legal institutional aspects of racism, we can actually, it's never that we're going to make people equal, and I don't think we should aim to make people equal. We're all different. But that we create enough variable and pluralistic ideas of blackness and whiteness and brownness and all the ones in between, that we can that there's enough ways that people can articulate who they are and identify with who they are in a way that's positive and meaningful in their lives. And that's the challenge that I think we're now under. And I think no thinker better articulates the fact that that's the challenge than Hannah Arendt, which is why I actually think Hannah Arendt has so much to contribute to the discussion on race. Whether she herself, had a vibrant idea of blackness or whiteness, I don't know. And I'm sure there's legitimate criticisms of things she said and ways she acted. That to me is a personal issue that's not part of her work. Her work, I think, opens the door to a much deeper and richer understanding of what it would mean to address racism after we address the legalistic and institutional aspects of it. And that's, to me, what needs to happen. Again, if people have comments or want to join in, I'm happy to hear other thoughts. Kim writes, it seems that Arendt would agree with the belief that you don't provide a fish to a hungry person, you teach the person how to fish. Yeah, I mean, I guess, yes. I mean, again, if the hungry person is destitute and starving, she's not opposed to providing them the fish, but she would rather. But another spin on that, Kim, is okay. Teach them how to fish if they want. If they want to do something else, let them do something else. Not everyone has to be a fisherman, and not everyone has to eat, a healthy meal. I mean, do we tell people not to go to McDonald's? Do we tell people not to eat Slurpees? These arguments are quote unquote for those people's own good, but they're also economic arguments, right? Well, we'll have to spend less on healthcare. We'll have to spend less on this. These are arguments that, without a doubt, remove people's freedom and choice. Again, I don't want to make too much of what Arendt would or wouldn't say about these debates. I don't think she's a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian. I know she's not. And I think to those who would like to use her as someone who would say, oh, she would always be in favor of personal liberty, I don't think that's her point. Her point is that we should be aware of the ways in which the embrace of the social question can lead to a kind of tyranny, and B, the way that the demand for purity and goodness and compassion in politics will lead to a kind of hunt for hypocrites that can morph into totalitarianism. Those, it seems, are to me are the issues. Peter says, yes, thank you. I'm technically teaching right now. Well, Peter, I don't know how you're doing that, but good luck. Are there anyone want to comment on anything or ask a different kind of question? Are there any passages that people want to take a look at? I can point some out. One of the I think one of the interesting parts of the text is her discussion of darkness, where she says on page 59 to 60, darkness rather than want is the curse of poverty. The idea, I think I've already talked a bit about it, but it's a fascinating claim on her part, which is that really what poverty does to us is not make us poor, it makes us invisible. And if any of you have read Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, Ellison was clearly channeling Arendt here, whether or not he read this or not. The idea that invisibility is the curse of a kind of, is the real political curse, is very much at the heart of that book. On the other hand, at the very end of the book, there's also a kind of freeness, a freedom in a chosen invisibility, where one is able to sort of avoid the system, the man, the different institutional and ideological webs that Ellison discovers, and it's an exceptionally beautiful articulation of different valences of freedom that one can find. Other questions or thoughts?
On page, Roger, on page 79 and 80, that little vignette about the surgeon cutting off the leg, the gangrene leg. And she's talking about pity, how pity can be overcome. Can you explain that one? I didn't get that had any not valid, but use. I didn't understand it, why she put that.
Well, Pat, the basic medical claim, I think, is somewhat clear. You get in an accident, and you're brought to the hospital, and the surgeon says, "I'm going to cut your leg off to save you." And he acts benevolent with his cruel and benevolent knife, cuts off the gangrene limb in order to save the body of the sick man. He doesn't ask the sick man, A, do you want to take a chance that you might recover? Or B, do you want to live without a leg? And should we ask the sick man that? But what Arendt's view is, well, how I appear and how I act in the world is very much who I am. And, I may want to live without a leg, and I may be grateful. But I also may think that that's just,
Excuse me. I have to interrupt that. She didn't say what you're saying. You're going into a dialogue that she doesn't talk about at all. She's talking that apparently the surgeon is operating under this pity idea, but she doesn't talk about any dialogue that the patient is removed from. So when you go in that respect, obviously now you've changed what she's talking about. I'm talking about the exact thing there that she says, not what you just said.
Pat, you have to try.
There was no dialogue in talked about.
Pat,
Can I jump in, Roger?
Yeah.
So actually, the quote that that Pat is pointing out about the gangrene is not Arendt is citing something. It's in quotation marks, and there's a footnote at the end of the passage. And if you jump to the back on page 282, where the footnote is, she first cites it. It's a document. I don't read French, so I can't read it in French, but it's footnote 3 from this chapter. And it's a text from the French revolutionaries themselves that was translated into a bilingual edition. And she says in footnote 30 at the end of the passage, I have quoted from number 57 from this text, this French text. Generally speaking, one may say that the more bloodthirsty the speaker, the more likely that he will insist on the tenderness of his soul. And I think she's using, so if I'm reading that in the context of her discussion of pity correctly, she's using this as an example to talk about how the extent to which pity can become pernicious and evil and kind of self-motivating. That the more one considers oneself to have pity for the suffering of others, the more harm they actually end up causing. You cut off the foot to be nice, but it's not really nice. It's pernicious for her.
Well, she does preface on page 79, pity taken as a spring of virtue has proved to possess greater capacity for cruelty. So
Right.
that makes sense in that context. But the idea that saying, just giving that little vignette without the dialogue that Roger gave, it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really follow the way I like to read things anyway.
I was just trying.
Yeah. No, I mean, the quote that Sam read is good, but you have to try and make sense of a text when you read it, right? And pity's taken as the spring of virtue has proved to possess a greater capacity for cruelty than cruelty itself. You have to try and understand what she means by this.
Your audio is going in and out, Roger. I'm sorry.
You have to try and understand what she means by pity taken as the spring of virtue has proved to possess a greater capacity for cruelty than cruelty itself.
If you're in an ER down in the Bronx on the weekends, you're going to see a lot of things cut off. You could say it's pity, but it's really a necessity, I would say. That's all. Well, I don't want to go on. I understand.
Well, let me
say. Points a little. If we keep.
Sam, you want to say something?
I was just going to say, if we keep reading past the quotation from the French revolutionaries, she's talking about how sentiments are bad motivation for revolutions, compassion, pity, empathy. And moreover, sentiments as distinguished from passion and principle are boundless. And even if Robespierre had been motivated by the passion of compassion, right, that would be the doctor cutting off the leg, his compassion would have become pity when he brought it out into the open, where he could no longer direct it towards specific suffering and focus it on particular persons. So she's using it as a metaphor to think of Robespierre as the doctor who in the private room of the hospital treating the particular patient.
Yeah, I mean, the where this goes.
We won't go on. We understand that pity is not the motivation for the good of the community.
No, I don't think we do understand. So I'm going to say a little bit more. Pity for her is a perversion of compassion, right? Yes. And while the surgeon may be compassionate to the suffering person with his leg, to the extent we are treating thousands of people with some disease, and we cut off all their legs in order to prevent greater disease. Or
okay, I can make up absurd examples of other things. So don't do that. Let's don't do.
If you don't want me to teach, I won't. But
you are teaching. You are teaching. That's fine.
The point is, you have to read it within the context of the text. What's the other example she uses? The Grand Inquisitor. We give people bread. We give people bread. That could be compassion in the individual case, but we do it in order to keep power. That's the argument she's making, that we over and again claim to be acting out of compassion and pity, but what we're really trying to do is keep our own power. So to go back to the surgeon example, I don't think this is an absurd example at all. To go back to the surgeon example, it may be that the doctor could save the person without cutting off his leg, but it would take more time, more money, more energy, and there might be other people who die. And so a lot of the time we cut people's legs off is not because we need to, but because it's the cheaper, more easy way to keep people alive and keep the costs of society down. That's a powerful argument. And I think that's the argument she's making. So I'm happy to keep talking about it. I don't think it's a silly argument. I think it's a really powerful argument. Pity is designed to empower the person acting out of pity, not to actually be compassionate towards the person benefiting from it. That's her argument.
I'm not standing up for pity, Roger. My point was, there's many things that Arendt does about when she has these footnotes that clarify something, although I'm not sure Samantha clarified it by that one. Arendt is a defensive writer, and she kind of writes all over the place. And so to say that something clarified something in the middle of this paragraph isn't enough for me. But we don't have to go on. I understand your position. If you cut off somebody's leg without discussing it with them because you think it's good for them, it probably isn't a good idea. That's pretty obvious. But if she had made that clear in the text, it would have been better. That's all. Sorry, I went on too long.
No, it's all right. That's just the first step. The second step is understanding that even if you discuss it with them, the point is pity drives us to act out of our own concern for our power.
Yes, of course.
Not out of concern for the person. And
I agree with that. I'm not here promoting pity as a motivation. But I didn't go for that particular one. We're entitled to have differences, and I had differences.
Oh, we are, and I'm not saying you can't, but I do think. I mean, I when I teach this book, this is one of those sections I spend a lot of time on, for precisely the reasons you're saying, and so I think it's important. It's very hard to understand. Nietzsche, right, also says that pity is the most selfish emotion because it sets you up above. But what it allows you to do here, I mean, and this is something that I think is very contemporary, right? When we say we're going to help people by, to use the example Bob offered before of the healthcare bill, force them to pay for healthcare. Compassionately, each case can make sense, but pitifully, it often can be that there might be much better ways to get each person healthy. And we're not actually interested in each person. We're interested in, our power and our wealth and keeping it with as little disruption as possible. And that's what I think Arendt is really after. That's the depth of it. That too often when we talk about our concern for people, we're not actually concerned for them. We're concerned more for our power and our institutions and our wealth. And that's
the problem with that issue is there are many when you're in a position of authority and you're trying to design programs for lots and lots of people. There are many things where you have to compromise. That point where she talks about negotiation and persuasion is true there. The word hypocrite has been used wrong. In other words, she uses the word hypocrites. But even the persons that we probably agree with sometimes have to be hypocrites in the sense that they're going to promise something, and when negotiation takes place, you're never going to get 100%. So in that sense, even the people who are, for good, let's say we're for people who are for healthcare are good people. If they had to negotiate that healthcare would not be able to accomplish neither Bernie Sanders or anybody else, because
Well,
they're going to be compromises. Compromise means giving up some stuff. So
there's different issues. She's not opposed to hypocrites, right? In fact, she's
that's right.
making a
It's true.
defensive
It's
hypocrisy.
truism, sure. Yeah.
She's making a defensive hypocrisy. In fact, what she says is nobody could actually appear in public with their true thoughts and feelings in the open.
Yes, that's true.
And we all hide ourselves, and thank God we do. And that's part of her defense of privacy, which we've talked a lot about in the past, and we had a conference on 2 years ago. So her part about hypocrisy is that the demand that people be pure is potentially terroristic and totalitarian.
Don't be.
As for compromise, yes, I mean, politics is about compromise. That's not, I think, an issue. Her point here is, again, that to the extent we enter politics with the claim of purity and pity on a mass level, generally we are actually being cruel, not compassionate. That's her claim. And I think it's one that holds up and needs to be thought through and addressed.
That's it for me, Roger.
Okay.
I would never mean to be disrespectful. You know that, Roger. So
I just wanted to make the point because I think it's actually a very important point. To me, this is one of the central insights of this chapter and one that is challenging to us all. So it's not about just, I totally respect your right to disagree and make points. I just wanted the chance to say it because I think it matters. And I think her critique of pity is one of the hardest things for us to accept because we all have become people who want to present ourselves in public as good. And, her willingness to say that we shouldn't want that is really shocking to us. And her willingness to say that insofar as we want to appear in public as good, we are cruel, right? And maybe more cruel than cruelty itself. That's an extraordinary indictment of us, of me. I know that. And so this is one of those sections. I'm glad you pointed it to us. I'm glad we spent a lot of time on it because to me, it's absolutely one of the most self-critical sections for me and hardest to grapple with. So I just wanted to make that clear. It's a very tough passage for me. Harold writes, if we look at empathy as rising above the interplay of sympathy, antipathy, empathy, sympathy, antipathy, would empathy be an element of solidarity as she uses the term? So, yes. And so I mentioned before that for her, empathy or sympathy, I mean, again, we have to try and understand what these terms mean. But if you understand them as she wants to, as not a passion, but as an intellectual practice of seeking to understand the perspective of other people and how the world looks from them, and therefore, having understood it, considering it and judging it, and saying, okay, I understand their perspective, and here's what I think. That is an approach to solidarity. If you act in such a way that you try and simply sympathize with them because they're poor in a kind of passionate way, in a kind of emotional way, that is not going to lead to solidarity. So one of the interesting points she makes is that sympathy, insofar as we understand sympathy as a kind of emotional connection with other people, for her is actually cruel and pitiful. But when and again, empathy, sympathy, I'm not, I don't want, it depends how we're using the word. But if we understand empathy as not an emotional sympathy, but a intellectual openness and consideration of other perspectives, that is the grounds for a kind of solidarity on her part. So the English words are not going to help us very much. I mean, trying to distinguish in English what empathy is from sympathy is hard. The root structure of the words don't help very much, at least not as she uses them. They both translate the German Mitleid for her, and to the extent that Mitleid is an emotion, she uses both empathy and sympathy as emotional words. And that's one of the reasons we have this problem in trying to speak about her in English. Solidarity is to be an intellectual passion. It may be worth reading the sections on solidarity if we want, but let me see some of these other questions. Suzanne writes, several times in reading this chapter, I was taken with the idea of the psychology of Hannah Arendt. I mean this in two senses, both her development of what strikes me as new psychological ideas, especially about emotions, and also the possible place of her own psychology in the development of the ideas presented here. Yeah, well, certainly the latter has been widely written about, Suzanne. There's a lot of people who've argued that these show that Arendt was heartless and racist and other things. Maybe she was. I'm not gonna get into that. I don't know. But the first point, I mean, you say what strikes me as new psychological ideas. Yeah, I mean, they're not new. I mean, the critique of pity that she makes is one that Nietzsche makes against Rousseau, by the way, and against others. And I'm sure she's somewhat indebted to Nietzsche on that question. But I imagine that some psychoanalysts like Freud make a similar view. But I don't know off the top of my head. Is that what you had in mind, Suzanne? Her critiques of pity, or something else?
Roger? This certainly the section on pity. Especially when she's talking about Rousseau, and she talks about his taking into his own heart his view of pity, and how that gets not pity, but compassion, and how that gets turned into a particular kind of intimacy, and the experience of a particular set of new feelings, that then lead us into pity and all of those other horrible things. So I had never really thought about that idea of how one kind of emotion gets internalized in such a way that it leads one indeed to fall in love with oneself, and then generates this whole set of other emotions that one takes out into the world. So I thought there was something, I mean, I'm intrigued with this idea of just reading Hannah Arendt in terms of what are the psychological insights here, because I think there are a number of them. And then in terms of the second, her own psychology, I had more in mind, not her heartlessness, but her own personal life experiences. And, I found myself at times in this chapter saying, wait a minute, where did this come from? And then wondering whether it wasn't just the ideas, the people she had read, but there was something about the life that she had led that brought her to a point where she writes what she writes. That's it.
It's helpful. I mean, we may never know, but if you go back and read the early chapters of Origins of Totalitarianism on anti-Semitism, one of the themes that she keeps coming back to is how the Jews chose to live in the darkness, right? Chose to live as a separate chosen people. They lived amongst the Germans and the Poles and the Russians, but they wanted to be apart, and that they chose to not be political. And she, over and again, comes back to this as one of their real mistakes, that it taught them to not be involved in politics, but also made them in a certain way invisible and outside from the political communities of which they were part of, and thus made them expendable in her way. This is not, again, about blaming the Jews, but she takes it she learns from this the importance of appearance. And this importance of appearance is a theme in her work, from the human condition, well, actually from Origins to human condition to Life of the Mind, and in this book as well. Where it comes from, is it deeper, more psychological than that, Suzanne? It may very well be. Some people read about the fact that her father died when she was young, and there's all sorts of these readings. I'm not that kind of a reader of texts in general, but there's no doubt that this deep belief in the importance of appearing and mattering and meaning is at the center of so much of Arendt's thinking, and really does distinguish her from, I think, many other political thinkers. Daphne writes, I'm not sure the healthcare bill was ever driven by pity, but by the comparative success of something outside the USA that are much more equitable. Even economic arguments. Yeah.
It's plans. I'm
sorry. I should have been able to figure that out, but I didn't. I'm sorry. Success of plans outside the USA that are much more equitable. Even economic arguments promoting the bill are relevant. Yeah, there's no doubt. Well, there's a lot of plans around the world, and I think that a lot of people feel that our current healthcare system is broken on so many levels, that it doesn't work well, that it doesn't treat people like human beings, it doesn't dignify people, and people want a new system.
Roger?
Yeah.
I live in Canada, so maybe that gives you a clue.
Yeah. So, but then there's a lot of people who would say that the way to do it is a single payer system, because that's the only way in which you're going to dignify people. And, there's a lot of critiques of the Affordable Health Care Act that are sympathetic critiques. They believe in the idea, but don't particularly like the way it was done. So whether it was done by pity or not, I don't know. To just come back to the pity thing, which I think we've talked a lot about, which is good. To the extent we address healthcare through the question of pity, we actually don't worry so much about how it treats individuals. We instead worry about proving ourselves to be good people. That's another way to put it. And if we're more concerned with the hypocritical, the issue of hypocrisy, and therefore of presenting ourselves as good people, than we are about how it actually affects people, that's how pity works in politics. And that's what Arendt is pointing out, is how often that happens.
I don't disagree with the argument that you made earlier about motivation for things. This topic was mentioned, but I think that it's not a matter of pity when it's a matter of policy that is economically driven, rather than because I'm terrified that somebody who's too poor to access health care is not going to be able to survive. That if that's not your motivation, I agree that when she argues that pity for the people that are less than us or have less advantage, I can see the argument to hold, but I'm just talking about the origins of Obamacare not necessarily having to do with that human emotion.
Yes, that's an interesting point, Daphne. One could imagine saying, look, let's take healthcare out of the emotional register and turn it purely into an economic question. I take that to be something along the lines you're saying. and let it be solved by technocrats rather than by emotion. In all honesty, that's actually somewhat close to what Hannah Arendt advocated for. So at a conference up in Canada, in I think a couple of years before she died, dedicated to her work, she responded to a lot of critiques of her work. And one of the main critiques of her work that people were making at the time and still are is her worry about the social question. And she said something which is somewhat enigmatic in that response. But she said, look, I'm all for a technocratic solution to homelessness. I mean, make sure people have a place to sleep, but don't make it, I don't know if she said it in these words, but it's not a compassion. It's not driven by pity or compassion. It's drawn by kind of technocratic. The basic level, we live in a society that's rich enough and smart enough to make sure everybody has a house and everybody has food. And she says that's not a political question, that's a technocratic question. And that may be, if I understand what you're saying, you were hoping the Affordable Care Act was about. I'm not as convinced that's what it was about. I think it was a lot of posturing and signaling as well. But that's a secondary question. Who's right about the act is less interesting to me. Peter, back from teaching or still teaching, asks again. She also, I think, relies heavily on Nietzsche's ressentiment in her discussion of Rousseau, but isn't the point that the goal of equity could be motivated by pity? Yeah, well, like I said, I'm very confident that she takes much of her critique of pity and Rousseau from Nietzsche, and this is in many of Nietzsche's texts, where he discusses and just devastates Rousseau on these questions. But even in Zarathustra, where he's not talking about Rousseau, he talks about pity as one of the most dangerous emotions. And so, yes, I think Peter's right. On the question of the goal of equity be motivated by pity, Peter, that comes back to the conversation Pat and I and others have been having, and I think for her, she understands why pity emerges, right? Which is why in that quote on 102 that I started the whole conversation off with today, she says that it's completely natural and expected that all revolutions will turn to pity when there's misery in the world. But I don't think she thinks pity will ever lead to equity. Ever. I mean, I don't want to be so absolute about it. I think she's much more suspect of pity than I take your question to be suggesting. She really does see pity as fed by a desire to prove oneself good rather than to be good. It's a desire to articulate one's own, in a sense, superiority. You ask, is she even interested in equity? If you mean by equity political equality, yes. If you mean by economic equality, no. If you mean by equity something like the legal term, treating people with justice as the situation deserves, yes. Equity is about correcting the injustices of equal treatment. That's how Aristotle and Blackstone, far apart, both describe equity. And insofar as she's interested in justice, she would be interested in equity. Suzanne writes, to what extent does it matter that she is writing about revolution? It's a good question. What I see as a particular point in time of society Do the ideas presented work in the same way at other points in the society's history? Well, I mean, it matters that she's writing about revolution because she thinks we have entered a revolutionary age for a couple of reasons. One of which is the loss of any metaphysical foundations for politics, and another is the loss of legitimacy of rule that is not free and self-determined. And what she is saying, and this is maybe one of those, not the only, but one of those overarching claims of the book, what she is saying is that revolution is about founding political freedom, and it is incredibly rare that revolution stays about that and doesn't instead get hijacked and become instead about creating, seeking to avoid oppression and create social and economic equality. And thus revolutions will usually fail to secure freedom. That is, I think, one of the core arguments of her book. And even the one revolution that did, in her mind, come closest to securing freedom, the U.S. Revolution, lost that treasure in the next 150, 200 years. Probably time for one or two more questions if there's two of the most interesting parts of this chapter to me are, one is this idea of hypocrisy and corruption on the one hand, and the other is solidarity. We've talked a bit about both of them. Is there a call to talk a little bit more about either one, and maybe you read a little bit and talk about it, or something else?
Could you answer Suzanne Ouellette's question?
Which one? The last one about revolution? This question about revolution? I thought I just answered that. Maybe I didn't do a good enough job. Why don't you ask it again? Who asked? I didn't see who asked that question. Suzanne, did I answer your question, or you want to ask it again?
No. I think if that's the question Howard is referring to, I think you did. I mean, when you said that she's writing about a revolutionary age, so she's not just writing about specific revolutions. I mean, in some ways, I guess we're always in a revolution, or the potential for a revolution. So yeah, I think you answered it. Also, when in your answer, you put us back to thinking without banisters again. I think. I mean, it's yeah. Okay. Thanks. But maybe Howard had something else in mind. I don't know.
Roger, this is Kim.
Yep.
Just going back to the fish story for a moment, because I don't think I really expressed myself well there. So what I meant was that the hungry person causes us to pity, but to teach the hungry person how to take care of themselves in the way they choose is to exhibit solidarity and not to pity or look down upon. That's kind of what I meant by my comment there. Is that on point?
You know, it's a tough one, Kim, and I thank you for bringing it up again. It actually fits with Gary's question, which just popped up about solidarity. You use the word teach, all right? And you know, one of the things that Hannah Arendt says, it's in her essay on the crisis in education, if you want to find it, is that all talk about education and teaching in politics is tyrannical and is unjust.
Yeah, I realized I didn't know what else to say, but I realized yes, teach again is unjust. I mean, is as if I know better than you.
Yeah, I mean, you can teach them to fish if they ask, right? I mean, you can, that's the technical question, right? We can
Yes.
have fishing clinics.
Yes.
And I think, again, fine, absolutely perfect. I don't think she would have any opposition to that. But what she's really so sensitive about, in a way that I think many of us aren't, is that as soon as we say to someone, you should be reading this newspaper, or you should be fishing, we are trying to tell them they should live like us. And that's what she's, as someone who grew up in Germany and lived through the rising totalitarianism there, she is deeply, as a Jew, she is deeply, deeply suspicious of anybody saying, you should live like us. You should do this way.
Sorry, again, I think I'm kind of under the assumption, I guess I'm just coming from the whole point of view, the way that I think is just that, yes, somebody's asking for help. I'm hungry, I'm asking for help. And that, yes, in that case, like we're not coming in and just saying to somebody, okay, you know what, we think you're not in a good situation and this is what we think you should do.
Yeah, no, but then,
no, that is tyrannical.
Yeah, yeah. So let me just answer. We're going to end with, we're going to probably go over a little bit, but I want to do this because Gary asked for it, and I actually think it's really wonderful. So on pages 78 to 79, really almost the whole page is 79, she discusses pity, and it's worth reading it, and I'll make some comments as we go along. Pity may be the perversion of compassion, but its alternative is solidarity. Now, let me just say, she doesn't write a lot about solidarity in her work. This is one of those terms that, for me, if you look for it, you can find this all over the place, but it's not sort of one of those terms that a lot of people who write about Arendt pay attention to. And I think it's actually one of the core concepts in her work. It is out of pity that men are attracted to l'homme faible, but it is out of solidarity that they establish deliberately and, as it were, dispassionately, a community of interest with the oppressed and exploited. So here we see pity is a passionate and emotional attraction to the miserable. But it's out of solidarity that we deliberately, dispassionately create what she calls a community of interest. Not a community of emotional attachment, but of common interest. And this, of course, is the challenge. What is the common interest of the rich, the powerful, the weak, and the poor? The common interest would then be the grandeur of man, or the honor of the human race, or the dignity of man. For solidarity, because it partakes of reason and hence generality, is able to comprehend a multitude conceptually, not only the multitude of a class or a nation or a people, but eventually all mankind. So this intellectual solidarity, this intellectual community of interest about the grandeur of man or the honor of the race or the dignity of man, as a rational, general concept, can say, look, all of us, white, black, rich, poor, Southern, Northern, even American Russian or American China, but all of us in some way can understand a kind of solidarity which partakes of all mankind. But also, I think you can make this argument within a country or within a smaller area. But this solidarity, though it may be aroused by suffering, and this, I think, goes back then to the point of someone who says, Peter's point about whether pity, no, it's not pity that can arouse a solidarity, but I think compassion, suffering. But this solidarity, though it may be aroused by suffering, is not guided by it. And it comprehends the strong and the rich no less than the weak and the poor. I mean, that's one of the things that is so important to her and people don't want to talk about, right? A compassion for all means all. And it's not just one directional. The poor have to understand and have a kind of solidarity with the rich, and they must see the suffering of the rich, something that doesn't get talked about so much in our society, despite the fact that so many rich people are deeply unhappy. Compared with the sentiment of pity, this solidarity may appear cold and abstract, for it remains committed to ideas, to greatness or honor or dignity, rather than to any love of men. Pity, because it is not stricken in the flesh and keeps its sentimental distance, can succeed where compassion will always fail. It can reach out to the multitude and therefore, like solidarity, enter the marketplace. But pity, in contrast to solidarity, does not look upon both fortune and misfortune, the strong and the weak, with an equal eye, without the presence of misfortune. Pity could not exist, and it therefore has just as much vested interest in the existence of the unhappy as thirst for power has a vested interest in the existence of the weak. This, again, is a point that is widely made in criticisms of the human rights industry, if you call it such a thing. But you can see it in our world. We can never solve our social problems because those of us who believe ourselves good and pitying people need the social problems in order for ourselves to feel like we have a purpose. And so she's very clear that the interest of those who pity is usually in their own self-presentation of themselves as pitying, as good. Moreover, by virtue of being a sentiment, pity can be enjoyed for its own sake. And this will automatically lead to glorification of its cause, which is the suffering of others. We love to see others suffering because then we can enjoy ourselves being good and pitying. Terminologically speaking, solidarity is a principle that can inspire and guide action. Compassion is one of the passions, and pity is a sentiment. The point here is that a principle for Arendt, which she takes as a word from Montesquieu, is not something that has any foundation or has an emotional attachment, but is a guiding idea that emerges over time in society out of judgment. And it's out of these judgments that we come to see principles like the dignity of man, not based in emotions, but based in an intellectual attachment to them as something that we see as who we are. Anyway, I think that's probably enough of reading about pity and solidarity. But I think you'll get to see, and this goes to Gary's question, solidarity in the context of today's political situation. It requires an intellectual leap, an intellectual concept of the common interest of all. You know, we hear a lot now on the left of we have to understand that the poor whites, are suffering, and it's an emotional attachment. But that's not what Arendt has in mind. We have to understand also that they're suffering, but also that they're attracted to their lifestyle, that they like the way they live, that they actually think their lives, while there's some pain in it, are valuable. And that's something that's very hard for a lot of people to get their heads around. How do we conceptually imagine solidarity with the Russians or the Chinese or, again, the people? I don't know about the leaders. How do they manage in solidarity with us? It's another good question too. But what she's really talking about is a non-emotional, non-sentimental, principled solidarity, and something that's very difficult to imagine. I think it's even more difficult to do because it really does require listening to other people with a depth that we rarely do. I think climate change and the idea that we're all in this together is one aspect of this, but so is trying to have solidarity with those who might say, look, I need to I need a job, and climate change is not my thing. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them. You can make judgments that they are wrong, but you have to first see ourselves as having a common interest. And then if you disagree with them, you have to see them as common enough that you're willing to argue with them and try and convince them, and not say to them, oh, you're stupid, you don't understand, or it's not worth arguing with you. You actually have to make the effort to see them as part of the world you live in. All right. I want to thank Pat for getting us going. I thought it was a great question, and I'm really glad we got into the question on pity. I'm sorry I used my professorial prerogative, but sometimes it's important to get these ideas out. We're meeting now on a 2-week schedule. We had to do this for calendrical reasons, but I think we're going to meet in 2 weeks to talk about the pursuit of happiness. Very much enjoyed today. I hope you all did and continue to enjoy reading on Revolution. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Roger.